In this first game, we're going to look at one of Sergei Karjakin's endgames as a 10-year-old, so quite early in his career. And here he plays a game against Vladimir Klimanski in the Ukrainian Championships in the year 2000. So yeah, as I said, just 10 years old. And the reason why I've picked this game from one of his games in his early career was because the way he handled the endgame. He handled the endgame in a very mature way, I thought. And normally children who I teach from around that age, they tend to say the endgame is very boring. You know, why should we bother studying it? There's not so many pieces. You know, where's all the action? But the reason why I picked this is because I thought that he really played it in a nice way. So we're going to skip ahead to move 59. And here you see on the board we have this position. Karjakin as white, a pawn up, but there are still some technical difficulties to overcome. One of them being that black has this pawn on f2, which is very dangerous for white, because if he could play f1, of course, he's going to be winning. The problem for black is that black is unable to actually try and force that through. So what do we think black's plan is? Well, black would like to swap off this pawn on f2 for one of white's pawns, such as a4 or g4. And then he will try and draw the endgame a pawn down. We'll be looking at that in a moment about the techniques, in case you do not know. But here we see white trying to force a sort of position where he will get a favourable endgame with the rook and pawn against the rook. So black played king g7, and this actually entails like a kind of threat here, because black would like to force through f1, but what he needs to do is get his rook behind the pawn. So what he's going to do is try and put his rook on h2 all the way to somewhere like f6. So how do you think black is going to be able to do that? Well, what he's going to be able to do is he's threatening to play rook to h6 check. The white king has to move, and then rook to f6. And I think this is the threat that the opponent is threatening against Karjakin right now. So here, Karjakin played king to d7, and this was quite a nice little move, because now black cannot go rook h6, because he would lose the f-pawn just like that. And I think 2 pawns against the rook is probably winning a lot easier, doesn't it, than just 1 pawn. So black decided, well, I'm going to play back to g6, and Karjakin now played his king back to e6. So kind of little dance there going on between the kings. But Karjakin has managed to get his king in a more central square, and he's just waiting for black to try and play f1, isn't he? Black, as we said, hoping to go f1 and possibly bringing the rook behind one of the pawns, the a-pawn or the g-pawn. So black decided, well, I'm just going to wait as well. If you're going to move your king around, then I will as well. Karjakin brought his king in the centre, so we see this kind of little dance like this, and the king becomes in a more central position. King g6 again, and a5. So if black's not careful, we're going to see white just charge the a-pawn all the way up the board, quite simply to a8. So black decided, well, I think this is the time to try and, you know, swap off the pawns. Just going back a little bit, if we see after king e5, I think this is where the computer says the position is probably drawn if black sticks to the mantra of rook endgames, which is to put the rooks behind passed pawns. So what black should have done was actually play rook g2. And I think this would have been quite difficult for Karjakin to win, because if we go through the following line, king rook f4, protecting the g-pawn, king g6, a5, and now black gets his king in a really good position here. And I think this is the difference between the game and what happened in this variation here. The black king is on g5, and it just looks after that g-pawn, doesn't it? So the moment black is trying to play f1 and win the a-pawn for the f-pawn. So if we just go through a few more moves, you'll see exactly how that works. So a6, black plays f1, not losing the pawn, because black ends up putting his rook behind the passed pawn. And that's one of the key things to remember in any rook endgame. You know, can you put your rook behind your opponent's passed pawn? You want your rooks to be active rather than passive, and here we see black doing just that. And I think this is a draw, because if black ends up winning this a-pawn, black will only be left with trying to look after the pawn on g4. But here we see the black king in an absolutely perfect position to try and defend against that. So, after king g6, which was played in the game, we see a slightly different position to what we just looked at there, the drawn position in the other variation. We see black attempt the same manoeuvre with rook a2, but it's not the same, because Karjakin now played a very nice idea. He realised that the pawn he would like to keep is in fact the a-pawn. And the reason why he did that was because, as we saw in the other variation, that a-pawn is very far away from the black king, and therefore it's going to be much harder for black king to try and get over and look after the a-pawn queening. So he decided that is the best one to keep. So he played rook f6 check, king had to move to g5, and now Karjakin had two options. He could have played rook a6, and I think this would have been winning as well. As a 10-year-old, I'm not sure whether he would have studied this. This would lead to a sort of Vancouver position. Won't really go into too much detail about what that is, but suffice to say that if we just see the following moves, white is simply going to charge his a-pawn up the board, and the white king is in a perfect position to try and help it to come along on this route like this to d6, and maybe come along to a7 in front of the pawn, and black basically should be lost here. So that's the basic idea of the Vancouver position right there. Going back to the actual game position, Karjakin played rook f5 check, and that does exactly the same thing of trying to maintain his a-pawn on the board. So after black took the pawn, he played king e6, and this defends the pawn laterally along the 5th rank, just like that. Let's just say we got this position in one of our games. There's still a lot of work to be done. It's very easy for white to allow the black king across all the way to the queen side, and maybe black can even draw this. So we're going to see how he still manages to keep control of the position. This is the one thing I'm very impressed about by Karjakin's play as a 10-year-old in this game. The way he never gives his opponent a chance to get back to the drawn position that we looked at earlier. Rook c2. I think black is hoping that white is going to play a6. Can you see what he would do in that position? Black would simply go rook c6 check, and in fact white has to be careful he's not losing, because if king e5, black may even be able to win with this move and a skewer through to the rook. But basically this position is a draw after king d7, and rook takes a6, and white has lost his advantage. One of the pitfalls that Karjakin has to try and avoid in this game, and he does it with good style actually. Instead he played rook d5. So why do you think he picked that square rather than any other square along the 5th rank? Well, what he's decided is that black's king would like to head towards these squares on a7 and a8. So what he's done is he's trying to sort of form a cut-off barrier like this. So if black's king would ever even get to the e file, he cannot cross that d file, and that is why he put the rook on d5. It's a very, very careful play, very mature play from Karjakin here. So he's setting himself up for the a-pawn push, but he's getting his pieces in good positions, and that is the hallmark of a good player, and I think a lot of people would notice that about Karjakin at this time, at just 10 years old. King f4, and in this position, of course, white has many ideas. He can try and run his king over to the queen side, but instead he decided that he would put his rook behind his own pawn. So he played check on d4, the king had to move, and then he played rook a4. So here we see him putting his rook on a4, and he's basically just saying, I'm just going to throw this pawn up the board towards a8, and there's very little black can do about it. Remember we said about black would like to put the defending side should put the rook behind the pass pawn, but it's not possible to put the rook on a2, is it? Because white has that under control. So instead, he will have to go passive. He will have to try and run to a8. And that is exactly what black does not want to do. Because if he does that, the rook cannot really move anywhere, and the white king can simply just say, okay, I'm going to go towards b7 and kick you away. And we're going to see that happen right in the game. So, rook h2, a6, here comes the pawn. Rook h6 check, a bit of a spite check. I don't think really anything is going to happen for black. And this is quite clever by Karjakin to bring this king all the way back on this diagonal, because now he realizes that black has no checks. The black king sits on e3, and it now gets in the way of any check along the 3rd rank. So black has to now go passive, as we said, like this. And the black rook does not want to be passive because now he can't move, and it's simply a case of what white should do next. So have a little think about what you think white is going to do to win this position. And here we see him simply bring his king up to c4. The idea is to go back all the way towards b7, like this, and this will be a simple win for white. So a very nice endgame there by Karjakin. We see his opponent had the chances for the draw, and once he lost it, I was very impressed by the way Karjakin managed to hold the position together. He was very careful about playing any quick moves. It's clear he thought about his moves a lot, about what his plan was, what is he trying to achieve, and he was watching out also for his opponent's ideas of trying to draw and exchange off certain pawns on either side. So that's a good starting point for our DVD here. We see Karjakin play very maturely, and that will be the theme generally throughout this DVD, about Karjakin playing quite good moves at a young age, and this is the same example here.